Jim asked me to wrap this up with a few comments. I won't try to summarize, but I must say I learned a lot about water in sitting in on the panels. They were very good panels. Let me tell you 4 experiences I had from which I learned something. I'll go along what I learned. And then have some summary comments, all designed to get you to take a look at this book. When I was Secretary of Labor in 1969, the President appointed me chairman of a cabinet task force on the oil import program. President Eisenhower had thought that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we used, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. So we had a quota system, and we were getting close to it. That was the reason. So we had a very good task force, and we published our report. The report said the problem isn't so much military, it's that there's all this tension in the Middle East between the Arabs and the Israelis and so on, and you never can know when suddenly that source of supply is going to disappear or be reduced. So we ought to cut down our dependence on that oil, no more than 10%. We ought to create some reserves so we'd have something to draw on. And by the way, we have a sense from what we've studied that there's a lot of stuff up north of here we ought to pay attention to. And our little task force now knows more about the subject than anybody in the government. And energy is an important subject, and there ought to be somebody paying attention to it. So the president patted me on the head, said, "Nice report, thank you." There were hearings, people were interested, and nothing was done. And it seemed to me the lesson I draw from that is, it's very hard to get something done on the basis of a strategic analysis, even though you think the analysis is practically open and shut. So then I get moved over to be the first director of the Office of Management and Budget. And President Nixon signs the act creating the EPA. And when there's a new agency created, it doesn't have anybody to represent them. So if they're not careful, they get the worst of everything, because they got to get space and something for other. So the OMB becomes their representative. So we're not bad, we're a pretty good representative because we know where the bodies are buried and nobody wants to mess with us. So I helped get the EPA started. And it turned out that some of the people who were joining it were people on this staff, this task force I chaired. So I talked to them about why they were so interested and got some idea of the problems with our air and our water and so on that they had on their minds. A little of the environmental point of view. So then in 1973, by that time I'm Secretary of the Treasury, and what happens? The Arab oil boycott. More or less what we said would happen. And we don't have any oil. At that time, a lot of oil was used to produce electricity. So no Christmas lights. Gas stations closed on weekends. It had a big impact. Our national security was threatened, but so was our economy. So I come away from these 3 experiences saying to myself, you know, energy is a strategic resource, and you better pay attention always to these 3 things: our economy, our national security, and our environment. If you leave any one of those out of your considerations, you're going to lose people. They're all important. For instance, national security right now. I think our grid is really, really vulnerable to natural events like Sandy, but also to cyber attack or terrorist attacks, as we saw here in San Jose. So one of the things we should be working on is how do we create more energy where we use it, so we don't have the dependence on the grid. That's a national security issue. So then I'm Secretary of State, and I hear about scientists who think the ozone layer is depleting. There are credible people who doubt it. They all agree that if it happens, it's a catastrophe. So I was fortunate. I had twice a week private meetings with President Reagan, and we talked about this. And the president said, you know, we better take out an insurance policy. So we could go, we didn't have to fight with the people who were doubters. We say, okay, you have your opinion, we respect that. But there must be a little small bell in the back of your head that just could be wrong. And you agree that the consequences would be severe. So let's get behind an insurance policy. When it was clear this was serious, the entrepreneurial juices in the American economy kicked in. The DuPont company came up with something that we could go around to countries and say, do this, not aspire, put this into effect. And then when poorer countries were involved, we had a little fund and we could help them get going. And as we got enough momentum, out came the Montreal Protocol. And it worked. As it turned out, in all of the retrospect, the scientists who were worried were right. And the Montreal Protocol came along just in time. So I've learned a few things from these experiences. And I look at the current scene. Most of the science says the globe is warming. There are people who doubt it. They're credible people. They're honest people. They just don't think so. Personally, I respect the science. But more than that, there's a little video that my friend Gary Roughead has. He recently retired as Chief of Naval Operations, maybe you know him, great guy. This video shows what's happening to the sea ice in the Arctic. It's disappearing like this, and then all of a sudden, there's a discontinuity. So a new ocean is being created. That hasn't happened since the end of the last ice age. Something is happening to that. That's real, that's not science, that's just observation. And there's a lot of the big ice melts going on around the world. That's observation. It's there. How is that happening? It's getting warmer. That's at least my opinion. So I think we should go to the people who are doubting, say, look, how about an insurance policy? I'm part of a little effort that will come out next week, I think, sometime, called Risky Business. And the object is not to have an argument about whether climate is changing or not, but to say, look, if it happens, here are the sorts of things that happen. And if these consequences bother you, how about an insurance policy? What is the insurance policy? I think the basic insurance policy is really inexpensive. Number one, have sustained significant support for energy R&D. This is working. And when it's clear, as in the case of the Montreal Protocol process, when it's clear that from the governmental level, this is an important problem and money is being put into it, money doesn't come unless it gets appropriated, and it takes both parties to appropriate any money. When that's clear, private money comes. At MIT and Stanford, I'm very familiar with both programs. I chair the advisory board of both, what's going on. In both those cases, the private money far outweighs the public money. Why is the private money there? It's all energy and users and so on, because they want to know what's going on and have an inside view. And we're glad to have them, because in the end, if you come up with a good idea, they're the people who know how to commercialize it and scale it. So support energy R&D. Incidentally, keep the government out of the business. Because what happens, you have some good things and then there's a clunker and it ratchets itself back against the energy R&D. So go easy on the getting into business. So energy R&D is a big thing. And it is very productive. In this book, it has this. About 3 years ago, we brought here about 12 scientists from MIT, about the same number from Stanford, and I think we had one from Berkeley and one from Livermore. We spent 2 days talking about game changers in the energy field. And we had a return visit to MIT, the same thing. So the book is an effort to pull together some ideas out of this. And when we got through, we said, well, other universities are doing things. And so we wrote around and quite a few sent examples of things that they had done. And we tried to get 3 classifications. 1, examples of presently commercial operation derived from energy R&D. Number 2, examples of things that are really on the cusp, and you can be almost sure it's going to happen. It just takes a little more effort. And number 3, things that are further away, big game changers, but very competent people are working on it, like large-scale storage of electricity. When somebody learns how to do that, that's big time. That takes out the intermittency of solar and wind. It also gives you some distributed energy. It's a big. So we've divided it into those 3 categories. And I think it's quite certain that if this process of energy R&D continues on a significant sustained basis, there will be really substantial results that will change the game. So that's the work. The other thing that would be part of my energy policy is a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I've written this with Gary Becker, late Gary Becker. Even the Wall Street Journal published it. And people say, well, that's not going to happen. I'm not so sure. Who is the biggest private energy company in the country? Exxon. Here's what is written in an Exxon report that was published in the end of March. They say, when governments are considering policy options, ExxonMobil advocates an approach that ensures a uniform and predictable cost of carbon, allows market prices to drive solutions, maximizes transparency to stakeholders, reduces administrative complexity, promotes global participation, and is easily adjusted to future developments in climate science and policy impacts. We continue to believe a revenue-neutral carbon tax is better able to accommodate these key criteria than alternatives such as cap and trade. So a big company endorses a revenue-neutral carbon tax. I don't think it's impossible if we work at it right. And if you get a tax on carbon, that's the key. So everybody realizes it puts, the way Gary Becker and I framed it is, let's put energy on a level playing field. And those forms of energy that produce carbon are producing a pollutant. And they should carry that cost. Otherwise, it's not a level playing field. And so I think if we give strong, sustained support, sustained is a key thing. And one of the things that worries me, I like the natural gas and all that, but what worries me is that if people see, oh, well, here's natural gas, it's now inexpensive, we don't have to worry about it. I've seen this roller coaster. I remember when I was Secretary of Treasury, and we had the Arab oil boycott, and people would come in, I was in effect the Secretary of Energy, and tell me about alternatives. And well, they weren't pie in the sky, but they didn't have the reality that now is there. But still they were interesting, and I supported them. But as soon as the price went down, bang, everything's gone. So this time it's got to be different. This time we have the largest body of scientists and engineers, first-class people, working on various aspects of this subject that we have ever had, not only here, but elsewhere. And we've got to keep the pressure on and keep that going, because that's where the future lies. So I want to wind up by thanking Jim Sweeney for organizing this conference. It's a good conference every year. And Jim will be standing for drinks out in the hallway. Thank you all very much.